Welcome to another episode of Reimagining Cyber. This is Stan Wisseman with my co-host Rob Aragao. And Rob, we've had several episodes focused around software supply chain. And I think it was John Pescatori early on talking about SolarWinds. And then we had Steve Springett on from ServiceNow talking about Log4j. And, you know, Log4j was sort of a wake-up call for a lot of folks when they had to scramble to deal with this 0 day within their open source libraries and figuring out, you know, where the heck this was impacting them and who had it. And then it kept on having vulnerabilities throughout that month. You know, they kept on finding more. But, you know, I think, you know, one of the things that we've identified as a way of potentially helping in that process is something we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be a great topic for us to jump into. And you call back on exactly what happened back at that point in time, and the SolarWinds example is prime for where this is going to really be able to support organizations and hopefully not have something similar to that event happen again in the future. So let's jump in.
Okay, well, I mean, we're very fortunate to have with us one of the experts in this space. So today's guest is Justin Young, product leader dedicated to creating value for end users. Justin began his career in engineering and has since concentrated on developing products within the DevOps space. And currently he leads open source supply chain management products at Sonatype. Welcome to the podcast, Justin.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. Today's focus, while we have you on, is to talk about software bill of materials, or SBOMs. So I'd like to start with discussing the benefits and why do you think organizations should prioritize having SBOMs, you know, for their software, and how do SBOMs, in your mind, help with the transparency and enhanced security of software supply chains?
So obviously, from my bio, software supply chains have been part of my thinking for a long time. The thing that I think SBOMs bring to the forefront is a maturation of the software industry. As an industry, we're growing up. And so every industry goes through an evolution of due care, where you understand and regulate liability so that the end user gets more protection. And in the software composition analysis space, we often use auto manufacturing as an analogy for software development. There's plenty of examples throughout history where auto manufacturers are held liable for defective parts or defective parts that they brought in through their supply chain.
Right.
And so because of that, the auto manufacturing industry has created pretty advanced systems for defect notifications, for recalls. In fact, you can even get a bill of materials for your car, and it's possible to go to auto manufacturers and request one of these when you purchase. I think an even better analogy around SBOMs, though, is the food industry and FDA requirements, because people do expect that kind of bill of materials when you're walking through the grocery aisle. And so when you pick up a box of cereal, you're expecting to get the ingredients that build that box of cereal. And the food industry in general has built a pretty advanced process to be able to recall things when they go wrong.
And I remember Jeff Williams back in early 2000s, you know, having a big push for using that ingredients analogy, right? And saying, we need something similar for software. You know, way back 20 years ago, he was pushing, you know, this, you know, concept, and it didn't catch on at that point. Of course, we didn't have as many problems as we've had lately, as to help motivate why we need this, right?
Yeah, but Justin, that is the perfect analogy, that nutrition label. I think it makes people kind of connect the dots as to what an SBOM really should look like, if you will. You know, one of the major pushes from government towards, you know, driving mandatory SBOM generation kind of capabilities is coming pretty hard. And I think, you know, it's important to get a good feel from what we're seeing out there in the market overall. Are there any specific regulations, mandates that you're seeing that are helping influence suppliers to really go forward and adopt the SBOMs?
So surprising or not, FDA is one of them. FDA, you know, manages the requirements around selling medical devices. So the FDA now has SBOM requirements for those who sell software into medical devices and those who sell medical devices with software. And so obviously they're using their extensive experience through the food industry to apply very similar things to software. Overall, in the States, the national cybersecurity strategy is to shift the liability away from the end user and push it towards those who are capable of making a change, those who have the agency to change what's in their software, and those are the software vendors themselves. And another, I would say, beneficial move for the industry as a whole is to move the liability away from the open source developers and the open source ecosystems. And again, go back to the consumers of open source, the commercial vendors who are profiting off open source. And the reason I think this is a good move is there's just plenty of data that show that open source projects are typically very reactive to bugs and vulnerabilities. And when Log4Shell came out, the Log4j project was able to fix that in a number of hours. Subsequently, over that course of December, those who remember or will never forget,
yes,
there were multiple different vulnerabilities found in Log4j by tons of eyeballs looking at the project, but the project itself continuously fixed it over the course of hours. So commercial vendors are being held liable of keeping up to date and ingesting those fixes by projects that are actively maintaining those. Or also to stay away from sunset projects and make programs to move over to open source that is actively maintained.
What about the government? I mean, isn't the U.S. government also pushing software supply chain kind of risk mitigation to the agencies, as well as potentially driving some of the need for SBOMs? Are you seeing some of that?
Oh, 100%. So, and this is U.S. and outside of the U.S. In the U.S., we have the CISA attestation form, which I think is probably the most wide-reaching of requirements. Anybody who sells software to the U.S. federal government has to provide an SBOM. That's coming up in a few months, half a year, when that actually gets some teeth behind it. We have DORA. If you're a financial institution, if you serve a financial institution, you have to have SBOMs. PCI, there's a massive number of...
that's right, in 4.0, PCI 4.0.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. 4.0 has a section in the requirement 6 around SBOMs for anybody who works with payment cardholder data. And then in the EU CRA, any physical product that contains software is now also going to be held liable, or has this requirement around providing SBOMs with the physical product.
So there's several different, or at least a couple major vectors of SBOM format or standardization. I mentioned Jeff Williams and OWASP. OWASP obviously has one of those under Cyclone DX. And we know the government is also under Dr. Alan Freeman. He's been leading the charge initially through NDIA and now with CISA. And so are these regulations driving, ultimately the use of a specific format, or is it left up to the organization or the software producer to produce, their SBOMs in a certain format? And what are the pros and cons as far as like SBDX 3.0 versus like Cyclone DX? And in some ways, I don't want to get into the religious war. We don't have to go there, but just at a high level, what's going on with all these different formats, and does it really matter?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is going to be a VHS and Betamax thing where there is a winner, or whether it's going to be like an XML and JSON thing where there's just different transmit formats that we use throughout time. Realistically, no regulation that I know of mandates a particular format, but they are focused on the ability to distribute and consume SBOMs. And so interoperability is important there. So I'm glad we only have two.
Yeah.
In particular, Cyclone DX, you mentioned, it was built for SBOM, so it was built SBOM in mind. It's supported by OWASP. You mentioned this as well. And SBDX was, although originally created to ensure that software vendors were compliant with software licenses, it has had extensive investment recently to move the focus to SBOM, and that's supported by the Linux Foundation. The big evolution in SBDX recently is the SBDX 3.0. It was released a couple months ago. The addition there is understanding that consumers of SBDX SBOMs typically wear different hats and have different needs. And so they introduced this thing called personas, where you can have SBOMs that are distributed to, let's say, a security AppSec persona. Well, that person cares about vulnerability metadata. And so as we think about the use case of SBOMs, we're still in the early phases, but it's going to scale out to things like AI and data and other use cases we haven't thought about before. These kinds of personas allow the format to be extensible, but not overwhelming to anybody in particular.
Well, I think a sign of that is the S in SPDX has been changed from software to system, right? So the idea being that you could have a bill of materials for not only your software, but your hardware, et cetera, right? I mean, so it's extensible to, the data model is extensible to cover these other areas.
For sure. And hardware manufacturers have lived this life for a long time in bill of materials, but being able to normalize it because hardware, software, this all kind of gets packaged and sent together is going to be beneficial for the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Justin, I want to kind of delve into it from the procurement side of things, right? So each organization is kind of trying to go through and establish and enforce requirements for vendors to provide the SBOMs. From your thoughts, what are you seeing as kind of, the areas that they should really be focusing in on? What are the questions they should be asking? Just kind of what's going to help them get what they need to be able to ensure that they're having proper security of their applications, they understand the different components within the software. So it's better visibility for them. But again, from that procurement aspect of it, if you will.
Yeah. So I've been talking to a lot of people who are in a position of procuring COTS and third-party software, and I think they have a general idea of what they want. It is just going to be a journey to get there and to actually hold their vendors to be able to provide the SBOMs. So kind of the repetitive asks, to your point, what do we have to continue? What strategies do we put in place to continue to ask the same thing? Will lead to processes and an environment where those are available. Luckily, we have a lot of tailwinds around the compliance standards, around people who have to deal with the federal government and PCI and everything else we talked about before. Luckily, those compliance standards are enforced not only for those who deal with those industries like the federal government, but those who provide software to those who deal with those industries. So all that being said, that it's going to be more and more common when you request an SBOM for a vendor to have that available and easily accessible. But to your point, how do we get started? During procurement, make sure you request SBOMs. We're a software vendor at Sonatype, and it comes up fairly often nowadays that, our legal department has to provide an SBOM during the services agreement, during the point of sale. But it goes beyond just that, validating the SBOMs themselves. So you get an SBOM from a vendor, being able to make sure first it's structured correctly, and that's fairly easy. Going back to the talk about SPDX profiles, there's an extensibility of that structure, but validating it, make sure that your vendor knows what they're doing. And then finally, making sure that the contents or the data in that SBOM holds true to reality. So one of our tools at Sonatype, the SBOM manager, actually allows you to do a binary analysis of the software that's provided to you. And so this allows you to validate the components that are attested or that they are within that SBOM to ensure that you and the vendor have the same understanding of reality, right? And so that kind of trust and validation allows for a better vendor-purchaser relationship. And then also goes back to a better conversation about what you're buying and what you are running within your infrastructure.
And what you're describing there, Justin, is a program. I mean, you do need to have somebody sort of, overseeing all these pieces and parts of the process to make sure it all works effectively. So you've talked to a lot of customers. Who have you seen sort of like with that hat on to say that, okay, this individual is sort of driving this SBOM process in the organization? Is there one individual that's been tagged, or do you find that it's distributed among the different, business units or within the application owners?
Dan, I love that you use the term program, because I was talking to a customer a couple months ago, and for the very first time, I was talking to an SBOM program manager.
And you're like, yay!
Yes, we found the person, right? And so that was an organization that did the ROI calculation about the program itself and realized that it would be more valuable for them to invest heavily in someone to manage it to success than to just kind of let it happen organically.
Which honestly, if you just sort of let it try to happen organically, I don't think you'd have all those pieces worked out that you just described that you need, come together it's like it'd be a patchwork, right? And then do you actually get an implementation that delivers the return on investment you're hoping for?
Yeah. And that's where the compliance comes in, because people will be, or organizations are going to have their feet held to the fire to make it successful, regardless of whether it's going to happen organically or not. But going back to setting people up for failure, often the program itself gets hoisted on application security. So application security has a seat at the table during procurement. They understand vulnerabilities. They understand open source. Those who have, are familiar with SCA know that like 90% of the application is built off open source. So all of this stuff makes sense to them, and they speak the right language. And so, unfortunately, you speak the right language and you're sitting at the table, you get a new job. Congratulations. And so, application security groups are often the most I talk to most often, more than anybody else, because they have been hoisted this job of SBOM management. The good thing there is they are at the right table, and they do have that understanding. So despite being stretched way too thin,
Right.
They typically are in a place where they can at least define the program and understand what would be necessary for success. And that is, again, with SBOMs, the ability to understand all the open source and all the COTS that you run, all the third-party software that you run, so that when something like Log4Shell happens, you don't have to go running around. You have a full bill of materials of every piece of software that you are running, and you can go back to the vendors and say, hey, we need a new version of this.
Yeah. Now, one of the things, Justin, you talked a little bit about earlier was kind of the legal aspects of it. You've talked about even within your organization and how that's going back into legal as part of some of the contract discussions and ensuring that the SBOMs are detailed out. When you think about the kind of legal implications, the risks that organizations need to take into consideration around SBOMs, what are those things that you can help with, share to the audience? What should they be thinking about from that legal aspect of it?
Yeah, so there's two different things that SBOM solves, and I typically say it's a procurement and distribution, and kind of put them in the same area, but they are different functions. So like with anybody managing SBOMs, legal has two different functions as well. So on the distribution side, if you are a software vendor, you are going to be asked for SBOMs. If you are a software vendor dealing with the US federal government, that's coming very, very quickly. And legal is usually that person who is the touch point for that kind of ask. And SBOMs, the compliance regulations, the standardization on SPDX and Cyclone DX, the kind of proliferation of this conversation is hopefully going to assist legal in having those conversations with their app dev teams and the rest of the organization. There's a common vernacular for this now. It's not just give me a list of all your open source, please. Give me a list of all your dependencies, please. It's, hey, can I get an SBOM? There's a common format or two, as we talked about before. And there's an awareness amongst application teams as to what needs to be provided so that the purchase of or the selling of software can go seamlessly. Another thing legal needs to be aware of is when distributing software, what are the legal obligations of the software that you're distributing? And so early on in the software development process, hopefully ensuring that application teams pick software that meets their guidelines and meets their responsibilities to the legal obligations. You don't want to ship AGPL software, for example. That's just something that every legal team has in their forefront of their minds. SBOM kind of provides a trailing edge check for this. Obviously, you want it done very, very early on, but the SBOMs are going to have encoded in it what the legal obligations are, and your consumer is going to come back and ask, hey, why does this have AGPL? So constructing policies that can be enforced, hopefully, again, early in the development process, but then have that check in the SBOM at the very end to make sure that you're meeting your obligations of using open source.
You mentioned this earlier about that as you went through the process steps, and I was just thinking, in my mind, some of these large organizations, I mean, you have in any organization a lot of COTS, open source software in use right now, right? And let's say you're successful and you have the necessary means to get SBOMs from your suppliers. That's wonderful. But but then it's sort of like, what do you do with it, right? And you mentioned this new capability of the software of the SBOM manager you have. But I guess the concept at a high level is you're able to pull in all that information you're retrieving from your supply chain to then be able to process that effectively and get that managed and governed. Is that sort of like what you're trying to do, so that you can then act on it? And because again, I can imagine you have all this information all over the organization. I think as the size of some kind of financial institution like a JP Morgan Chase would be overwhelmed by all the SBOMs they've got to run, right? To go through and figure out what's going on. So that kind of governance of your success in getting the SBOMs from your supply chain I think would be a potential nightmare if you didn't have something to help you with it.
100%. So I've had conversations that lead to, well, these are just files. So we just need a file store. We have a AWS blob store up there, right? We can just throw them all up there and we're done, right? So what do you do with all these things once you get them? A file store is just not going to be sufficient. So we kind of look at the needs around SBOMs generally in 7 different ways. You need to be able to analyze them, store them, catalog. You have to search them, enrich them, monitor them, and audit them. And so you're going to your point, have to do all of those things at scale, which are custom processes that file stores aren't made for. You mentioned large financial institutions. We have customers that are talking about storing on the order of millions of SBOMs. And because it's every piece of COTS that you use, every version of commercial software that's within your organization, and every version of, let's say, a Postgres server that you're running, every version of software that you distribute, the scale gets very large. And so having software that allows you to do those things efficiently at scale is really the only way to be successful with an SBOM program. And so I'll take searching and cataloging, for example. There are dimensions that you care about on SBOMs, and those things are like, hey, what's the security vulnerabilities and are they exploitable? What are the legal implications, like we talked about? What's running in different environments? Those kinds of questions you want to be able to ask of your data store and do it efficiently. And so systems that allow you to do that will, again, allow you to be successful with an SBOM program. Something that I mentioned in that list was enrichment, and I'd just like to touch on that for a second, because earlier on, I talked about transparency and shared knowledge between a vendor and a consumer as to, okay, these are the open source components that are actually in your application. You want to have that consistency and validation so that both the consumer and the vendor agree that this is what they are buying or selling. Similarly, you want to be able to have a shared understanding of all vulnerabilities that have been declared within those open source components. So if I threw out a XZ, if XZ was running on a particular piece of software that I was distributing, and I said it had no vulnerabilities, that's going to raise eyebrows. And well, I'm pretty sure I read an article recently that that's not true, right? And so you want to be able to list all the vulnerabilities, but vulnerabilities are often mitigated through other processes, whether it's configuration or otherwise. You have a process of mitigating vulnerabilities that may end up with a component that's within your application that has a declared vulnerability, but it is not effective. And so you want to be able, again, to enrich your SBOMs that you distribute with that stance. Hey, this is not exploitable, and I have a defensible and documented position to show you that.
Let's take that one step further, right? So again, you talk about SBOMs that provide all that detail of the different components in the software product, vulnerabilities you can enrich as you talked about a bit, but the exploitability aspect, I just want to kind of go on that a little bit. So how would you be able to validate that the reality of the vulnerability truly being exploitable? Like, well, how do you connect the dots, if you will, There are different things out there to take a look at and map back into SBOMs as part of that.
Yeah. So there's two different aspects of that. One, which is a people and process approach towards SCA generally, right? And so SCA already, software composition analysis, already has a lot of this built into it with the ability to provide waivers, the ability to document those waivers, and the ability to automate some analysis of things like, hey, was a vulnerability reachable or not? But what matters in the world of SBOM is that communication, that shared understanding, right? It's that interoperability of the file. And so there's something called a VEX standard, vulnerability exploitability exchange, that has been formed around annotating vulnerabilities within your SBOM with that exploitability. Hey, this is something that exists within our component, but it's not exploitable. I'll take reachability, for example. There's in JavaScript, there's really cool technology called tree shaking, where you literally can take the functions out of your application that aren't being called, that aren't reachable. There's no reason that they sit around. So you could be using a JavaScript component where the world understands there's a vulnerability in that component. You have again, that shared understanding with your consumer that there's a vulnerability, but you want to say, hey, it's not exploitable, it's not reachable, and in fact, the function does not even exist in that piece of software that I gave you. And so this is where VEX allows you to take that stance and declare a position on whether that vulnerability affects your consumer or whether it's otherwise mitigated.
So I mentioned Jeff Williams and the whole nutrition label pitch that he gave 20 years ago. And honestly, at the time, it was kind of a novelty. It was a neat idea, but, you had no hope of it actually taking a hold of anybody, right? But it certainly looks like, as we talked it through, Justin, that SBOMs aren't just a fad, right? It sounds like it really is catching on. There are drivers that are pushing it, and you're talking to folks that are adopting it. Building in. You spoke to an SBOM program manager. That's, as you said, right? So you're not seeing this as just a fad. You think this is actually going to be staying around with us as far as something we will in the future continue to need to be worried about?
So if the Gartner hype cycle is any indication, we are sitting right in the peak of expectations at this point. So the hype is real, to your point, like 100% I was at RSA, and at RSA, we had an SBOM billboard on our booth, and everyone wanted to talk about SBOMs. Everybody knew that this was a thing. Everybody knew it was coming, and everything that we've talked about during this podcast, people are fairly informed of this. But the big question is next steps. And after that peak of expectations, you plummet, right? And so I do expect that we're going to go through an evolution of the space and the requirements that are going to make SBOM programs successful. But overall, they're here to stay. This is a great evolution of the industry. And I brought up FDA and auto manufacturing, food and auto manufacturing, where due care is an important part of building cars and distributing food. We need that in software as well, as it brings great benefit to the consumer. So understanding what composes the software that you purchase and understanding that what composes the software that you produce is going to make the world a better and safer place and make it way easier to react to vulnerability events, or even now in the world of malicious code, malicious events as they unfold.
So Justin, as we wrap up, I'd love to get your perspective on kind of the key challenges and opportunities you see for SBOM.
And I want to add something here, Justin, as well. I mean, not only challenges from the implementation perspective of SBOM use and management, but also, abuse. Do you think, again, we're sort of laying out the ingredients of software for the bad actors potentially too, right? So is this also an avenue that introduces, attack vectors into an organization?
So that's a great question. I think that transparency is important in any industry, and understanding what composes applications may, in the near term, open up attack vectors, but in the long term, make the producers of software more liable and understanding of what they ship, such that they build better, more secure software. And going back to the wording in the national cybersecurity strategy, that's what they're looking for: ship more secure software. And this has been a trend year over year over year. SBOMs are just a focus on the open source part of your software. So we've seen this year over year with first party code and holding people more and more liable for producing more secure first party code. This is an opportunity to address the fact that 90% of applications are open source, and there's a lot of more surface area out there that you should be protecting. What's going to make people successful in the future? Well, we talked about understanding what to do with your SBOMs. Like, what is that next step? Are you going to throw them all in a file store, or are you going to put them in some place that is manageable and is capable of driving the intended effect of SBOMs, which is understanding when a 0-day happens, where do you have software that's affected by that 0-day, and what should you do next? How do you hold your vendors accountable for that 0-day? How do you recall software? And then how do you make the world a safer place? At the end of the day, from an opportunity perspective, I love the shift of liability to the commercial vendors, and I just applaud the amount of time, effort, and just thought that has gone into this through the open source foundations that have been pushing this year over year. There's 90% of your software open source. There's an extraordinary amount of innovation that's unlocked by open source ecosystems, and allowing them to flourish allows us to go to market quicker with software, really leverage that power of open source and not worry about a lot of the foundations of our product and focus on differentiation. So as a product person, allowing me to continue to leverage open source to accelerate go to market and do it in a safe way where everyone is comfortable with the risks of it is really an ideal position to be in.
I think that's a great way to summarize it, Justin. And we appreciate you coming on, sharing and educating the audience on SBOMs. It is here. It's coming at them hard. They got to be ready for it. They should be supportive of it. I think you've come across and really explained what it's all about, and also some different things to consider as part of building out a program and in that potential new role, as you shared today, you get introduced to not that long ago here. So thanks again. Really appreciate your time.
I love the conversation, and thanks for having me on.
Hey, thanks, Justin.
Hello, producer Ben here, and back at the beginning of the show, Rob and Stan talked about a previous episode looking at the software supply chain. It was prompted by the Log4j cyber attack, but the points raised are just as valid today. It was episode 26 called Log4j Vulnerabilities, All You Need to Know and How to Protect Yourself, and it featured Steve Springett, who leads software security for ServiceNow.
Remote code execution essentially allows you to run code on that target system as whoever that application is running on. Therefore, you can then use it to infiltrate other devices, to pivot to other systems in that environment. It's a really serious vulnerability. And I believe the National Vulnerability Database has a score of 10.0, which I believe is the highest you can go. The only limitation is the creativity of the adversary.
That was Steve Springett of ServiceNow, taken from episode 26, Log4j Vulnerabilities, All You Need to Know and How to Protect Yourself. Thanks for listening to Reimagining Cyber. We've got some great guests lined up over the next few weeks, so do subscribe and follow to make sure you don't miss any episodes. Goodbye.